Our Notre Dame College Abrahamic lecture offers Dr. J. Michael Presimone, the 15th president of the college, an opportunity to make a few comments on the work of the Abrahamic Center that it's evolved over the past 25 years. Dr. Presimone.
Thank you, Sister Carol, and thank you so much for the leadership you've brought to this center in this important work. And I also want to welcome our speaker, Dr. Asma Afsarudin, who is so generous with her time and helping to prepare for this lecture today. I have a bit of a history in this work as well, having been at a couple of different institutions. One in particular was at an institution in Pennsylvania. We had a program called Common Heart, where we brought together groups from the Abrahamic tradition to talk, to study, to learn from one another. And I believe it sits at the heart of the mission of an institution like Notre Dame College to foster opportunities to have these kinds of conversations so that we can learn from each other and develop an appreciation for the rich history that all of these traditions bring. If we're truly going to live in a world of peace and harmony, we are going to need to better understand the points of view of others. And I think what we learn when we study the Abrahamic traditions is how much we have in common. You know, I am enriched by those who bring their experience through the lens of their tradition to my world. And I would hope that they're enriched by understanding more closely, more deeply, what it is that we believe as Christian people. So I really appreciate this program. It has been a real gem for Notre Dame College, and I hope that you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Afsarudin today. So thank you very much for being a part of this important program.
Thank you, Dr. Presimone. Today is our annual Abrahamic lecture for 2021. And as usual, we begin all of our meetings and special events with prayer. So our prayer today is going to be led by Dr. Zeki Saritoprak. Dr. Saritoprak has been the Nursery Chair of Islamic Studies at John Carroll. We are very blessed to have him here with us today because he has been very supportive of the Notre Dame College Abrahamic Center. He's done important work here in Cleveland. He's also the founder and the former Rumi Forum Chair for Interfaith Dialogue. So will you please lead us in prayer, Dr. Zeki?
The most compassionate, the most merciful. In the name of God, in the presence of whose name, nothing in heavens and earth can harm. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of the world. Peace and blessings be upon his messenger Muhammad and all other messengers of God, including Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Jesus. Our Lord, do not let our hearts deviate after you have guided us and grant us mercy from your presence. Surely you are the giver of all bounties. Our Lord, inspire us to thank you for your bounties which you have bestowed upon us and upon our parents, and inspire us to do wholesome deeds which you will be pleased with. And enter us with your mercy among your wholesome servants. Our Lord, in the Holy Quran, love and compassion are among your most beautiful attributes. Help us to reflect fully these attributes of love, compassion, and mercy on earth, and make our planet a cradle of love, compassion, and friendship. You said in the Holy Quran that you have created human beings in different nations and tribes so that they know each other and not fight each other and not harm each other. Oh God, we ask you for your love, Fill our hearts with love and compassion so that there will be no space in them for hatred. Bring us to love and respect for each other. Oh Lord, we ask you to help us to do good deeds for our common humanity. Unite us so that we can work together to make our city, our nation, our world a place where not hatred, but instead love, peace, and compassion dominate. Our Lord, the creator of heavens and earth, we take refuge in you. Protect us from visible and invisible diseases, calamities, both in this world and in the hereafter. Our Lord, grant us from your presence and mercy, and ease for us our matters with guidance. In you we trust. Guide us to the path of success and the path of righteousness. Oh Allah, we ask you for help in this world and in the afterlife. We ask you for help in our religion, in our world, in our families, and in our property. Oh Allah, cover our deficits and make us safe from our fears. Oh Allah, protect us from the dangers in front of us and from the dangers behind us and from the dangers right of us and from the dangers left of us and from the dangers above us. And we take refuge in you from the dangers from below us. Our Lord, do not hold us accountable if we forget or make a mistake. Our Lord, do not lay upon us a burden like you laid upon those before us. Our Lord, do not burden us with what we are unable to bear. And pardon us and forgive us and have mercy upon us. You are our master. So help us against the people who are disbelievers. Oh Allah, Lord of human beings, do away with our sufferings. Heal us as you are the only healer, and there is no cure except that from you, which leaves no ailment behind. We seek protection in the perfect words of Allah from every evil that has been created. Ameen.
Amen. Good evening, everyone, and we thank Dr. Presimone and Dr. Zeki for their wonderful prayer and introduction to our event tonight. Today we have Dr. Asma Afsarudin, who's a professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, Bloomington. She received her PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Johns Hopkins and previously taught at Harvard University and at Notre Dame University. Dr. Afsarudin has 8 books to her credit. The most recent one that's supposed to come out in 2022 is entitled Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know. So that will be coming out. The focus of today's conversation is her 2015 book called Contemporary Issues in Islam. So that will be our focus today. And then earlier work of hers, which was a historical study of the first Muslims, history and memory. So welcome, Dr. Afsarudin. So we'll move into our interview format with Ronil Reynolds, who you met briefly. Ronil, you want to say hello to the audience?
Hi, I'm Ronil Reynolds. I was a graduate of Notre Dame College in 2018 with a degree in marketing. It's lovely to speak with you guys today, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Ronil. I think all of you know me, so we'll just jump right in. Dr. Afsarudin, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are 3 of the world's great monotheistic faiths. They share a geographical area, the country of Israel, holy city, Jerusalem, as well as prophets like Moses, Abraham, and Jesus. So I want to talk about your book here in terms of contemporary issues in Islam. You know, I think all of us here, even the students who are watching this, you know, think of yourself 5 years ago. if you're a freshman or a senior, you're not the same person. Think of yourself 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So can you tell us about yourself, Dr. Afsarudin? What was the importance of religion in your life? Who did you learn your tradition from?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking you, Carol, for this very kind invitation to give the Abrahamic lecture. I want to thank you, Dr. Prasimone, Ronil, for taking part in this interview, and the Abrahamic Center for extending this very kind invitation to me. I'm truly honored by it, and I'm really excited by this opportunity to have this extended conversation with members of your community on matters that are of great importance to our faith traditions. So to talk a little bit about myself, I was raised as a Muslim. My family is originally from South Asia, then emigrated to this country. I grew up in Maryland, but religion, Islam, was very important to us. It defined who we were, defined our culture. So I grew up observing all the religious practices and the cultural practices that come along with that. Observed, the two major festivals, one that comes at the end of Ramadan, and another one that comes at the end of the Hajj, the pilgrimage season. So my upbringing in that way was rather traditional. I learned to read the Quran in Arabic. I learned to do the prayers, the daily prayers, learned the importance of certain values like charity, almsgiving, showing respect for the integrity and dignity of every human being. My parents, I remember, impressed upon me the necessity of being absolutely honest in my dealings and interactions with one another. All these values and the emphasis on, this kind of moral and a personal tradition of piety, if you like, were seminal in shaping who I am. Now, I think as I got older, though, maybe I became a bit rebellious. I was more of a person who was examining my own tradition more critically, reading up on it. And when I actually learned Arabic, of course, I think everyone knows that Arabic is the main language within Islam. The Quran is always recited in Arabic. The prayers are recited in Arabic. So as a child, of course, I did not know Arabic very well, except from, what I'd learned in my readings of the Quran and the recitations from the Quran. But when I studied it formally, a whole new world actually opened up for me. I suddenly realized that these words were very powerful. They spoke to me in ways that just an ordinary text could not possibly speak to me. There was magic, and I mean that in a very positive sense. There was profundity in the words that I encountered. And so through my own exploration of the Islamic tradition, its history, its trajectory of rich and dynamic growth through the centuries, led me back in many ways, but led me back in a way that was much more personally meaningful to me. And so as I engaged the Quran firsthand, its message really resonated with me. I found it to be, at the same time, of course, an ancient text full of profundity and wisdom, but at the same time, it was very much a modern text. The principles that it espoused spoke to me as a modern person, someone who was trying to make their way in the world, often without specific guidance, right, from our own tradition. I think this has happened to every faith community that I can think of. Secular modernity has been a challenge to us all, and it has led to all of us, I think in many ways, re-examining our traditions with a critical eye, engaging it more deeply, trying to extract from the resources of our tradition, principles and values that resonate with us in the modern period. And I went through a very similar experience. So it made me actually, I think, in a much more self-aware Muslim, not someone, who's engaging in certain rituals and practices because that's the way she was taught, but because I found personal and much more rich meanings in the carrying out of those observances. I was aware of the deeper inflections of these practices and observances. So I think it shaped me seminally. It also guided my intellectual and academic pursuits. And this is where I am. I mean, you mentioned that I've written a number of books. A lot of those topics were motivated by my own personal desire to investigate these topics in greater detail.
Great, thank you so much. Ronia, did you have a question?
Oh, yes. Okay, Doctor. So throughout your answer, I heard you use a few different names. You said Allah, you said God. My question, throughout the world, we hear different names for our Creator, like Alpha, Omega, Father, Jesus, Good Shepherd. Can you tell me a little bit about the names for Allah in the Muslim tradition and what they mean to you?
Yes, that's a great question. Now, Allah, the name in Arabic for the one supreme being, the Almighty, is actually a name used not just by Muslims, but also by Arabic-speaking Jews and Christians. So anyone who speaks Arabic will use the name Allah, regardless of their own faith background. Now, there are also 99 names or epithets meaning descriptors, right? Adjectives that describe some of the attributes that are associated with God. Some of the names that immediately come to mind: the most compassionate, the most merciful. All the chapters of the Quran except one begin with a formulaic expression, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. So these are additional names that have been applied to the Almighty within the Islamic tradition. He's also regarded as the protector, the sustainer, the one who gives life, the one who brings us to the end of our lives, right? The one who causes us to die, the one who is just, the one who's all-knowing. Again, I think a lot of these attributes will be familiar to someone from within the Abrahamic traditions, right? These are attributes we associate with the one and only supreme being. So these are not names necessarily unique to the Islamic faith. Allah, the Arabic name for God, is assumed to be the name for the universal God. And I just want to read a verse from the Quran, which drives home this point very forcefully. And I think it makes Jews and Christians in particular appreciate the fact that we do worship the same God, which is without doubt in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition. So this is a verse from chapter 3, verse 84. And the Quran says, say, and this is a command to both the Prophet Muhammad, who received the revelations from God, and to the Muslims who followed him. We have believed in God and in what was revealed to us, and what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and what was given to Moses and Jesus and to the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we submit to him. So this verse leaves no doubt in our minds that Muslims worship the one God who is common to the Abrahamic faiths. And then the verse actually exhorts Muslims to make no distinctions among the prophets. They were all righteous people. They all brought the same revelation from God to humanity. Although that revelation may differ in specifics, the fundamental message is the one and the same.
Thank you. That was a very rich answer. I really appreciate that. Like all living beings and institutions, even like Notre Dame College or the Abrahamic Center, it has grown over time. So, Christianity and the Catholic tradition is very different today than decades ago. And your book is called Contemporary Islam. So how do you see that Islam has developed since its foundation? Kind of curious about that. And just a personal kind of question on my part is, does geography have anything to do with kind of the daily practice of Islam? And So that's what I'm wondering.
That's a big question. And there would be a lot of history involved, of course. So if I want to give a very short version of the longer answer, and actually the longer answer, as you said, is to be found in my book, Contemporary Issues in Islam, but also in the earlier book that you referred to, The First Muslims, History and Memory. So obviously, as you pointed out, over time, certain features of the basic message change over time, and also according to geographical location, as you said. At a cultural level, there are varieties of pious and religious practices among Muslims. For example, if you go to North Africa, there is greater emphasis on the practice of visiting the shrines of holy people who are known to have, I think in the Catholic tradition, we basically call them saints, people who are known to have special charismatic powers. They were so pious that they were regarded as people who could intercede on behalf of common human beings in the divine presence, right? You would not see that necessarily in other societies, certainly not in more, shall we say, conservative countries like Saudi Arabia, where such folk practices would be frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
The culinary practices will differ quite a bit. Dresses, attire, I mean, you can see a huge variety of clothing. If you walk into a major mosque, say in the United States, in a large urban center where there are large Muslim populations, oftentimes immigrant populations who come over from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, you will find that, there are these differences in the way they look, but there's a fundamental unity in their worship. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all Muslims pray in Arabic. So if you walk into a prayer service at any mosque, anywhere in the world, you can expect to take part in the same service. The language is the same. It will all seem very familiar to you. So the details, the difference would be in, as I said, local expressions of piety, whether that takes the form of visiting shrines, whether that takes the form of sometimes playing music, sacred music. Some societies frown on music being part of any kind of religious ceremony. Others are far more open to that idea, right? So there are cultural differences, but ultimately the essence of Islamic practices and Islamic belief remain the same. And I would say that's also true, right? For Catholicism, there's a core of beliefs that everyone subscribes to, but there can be also huge variety in the way people seek to observe some of those practices and the way it plays out in different geographical contexts.
That's a really rich answer. I have to say, you opened my eyes to a number of aspects I hadn't thought about. Ronil?
So I want to bring it back to that answer you had. Once again, you said everyone prays in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question, and I'm also going to harken it back to your original one. I want to ask two questions in one for you, okay? So my first one is a little different. So like how Christianity has the Bible that is translated into multiple different languages and multiple different, like, and everything you could think of. Do we have something like that with Muslims in the Quran or the Hadith? Also, my second question is, do you have a favorite verse that you would like to share with us? And can you tell me a little bit of meaning behind that verse as well?
There are translations of the Quran into multiple languages. However, the translations never take the place of the Arabic Quran. So you don't recite from a translated Quran during prayer or any kind of formal religious ceremony. You always have to recite from the Arabic Quran. So that's why it preserves, as I said, that kind of unity among Muslims, because they can expect to use and hear the same language wherever they go in during religious ceremonies. The translations are important, however, because not everyone knows Arabic very well. And here you may see differences in translation. So I'm always very critical of almost any English translation that I pick up, so much so that I actually don't use any particular translation in my own work. I tend to translate the Quran as I go. Let me give you an example of, a quibble of mine with the nuance, but nuances are important, right? I think we all realize that. So one of my favorite verses, and I'll just give this to you now, and I'll give you another favorite verse of mine. One of my favorite verses is from chapter 9, verse 71. And it talks about and describes men and women as, I'll give you the scary Arabic word, as awliya of one another. Now, awliya can be a rather difficult word to translate, and it depends on the context. So the usual translation is men and women are the allies of one another. Some translations also use the word protectors. I actually prefer to use the word partners, because that implies an equal status, which is exactly what the verse is trying to convey. Now, again, you might say, oh, she's just quibbling over words. But I mean, nuances are important, right? And so a partnership is far more equal than I think the notion of protectorship or even an alliance. An alliance can happen not necessarily among equal partners, but the partnership conveys, I think, exactly what the verse is trying to convey, that men and women are partners in one another in the moral enterprise, that they're being enjoined to always command what is good and prevent what is wrong. So I actually don't rely on particular translations. Translations can be tricky, so can interpretations. So I think it's more a question of how certain verses are interpreted. If you compare earlier interpretations with later interpretations, we can see somewhat of a change coming in the way certain verses have been understood, depending on the historical and sociopolitical context. So this might actually hark back to Sister Carol's earlier question about how I might describe some of the changes that occurred in the later centuries compared to the early centuries. The understanding of certain verses changed, again, due to specific contexts in which Muslims found themselves in. To give you another favorite verse of mine, if I may, it's from chapter 49, verse 13, and let me also read that in English translation. O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous among you. God is truly all-knowing, all-aware, end of quote. Now, this I find to be a particularly powerful verse, and especially in the modern period, because I understand, and I'm not the only one, but many Muslim interpreters have understood it in the modern context as advocating pluralism, genuine religious pluralism, and exhorting people to get to know one another. Now, we all know tolerance is a good characteristic. It's a good virtue to practice. But we should ask, is tolerance enough for a modern world? There are so many different groups of people who live together, right? Is it enough just to tolerate those who are not like us? Those who don't have names similar to ours, those who don't look like us? Is it just enough to say, oh no, we'll let them live among us, but we're not going to interact with them. We're not going to know who they are, or try to attempt to learn about their faith, their culture, their ideas. No, we won't go there, right? But I find this verse actually exhorting us to come out of our comfort zones and to take that risk of getting to know others, people who are not like us. Well, get to know one another, a powerful command. And I think it really speaks to our modern situation, and especially now when we find that in American society, we are getting more polarized rather than coming together, right? And I think we could get beyond that polarization, those divisions that we have in our society, if we got to know our neighbors well. We found out who they are, and we may find that they're very much like ourselves, even though they may even speak a different language. It's that exhortation that I find profoundly relevant in our times, especially in our divisive times.
Thank you so much. Again, really rich answers that are answering questions I've had, I think, for years about the Muslim tradition. So an aspect of Islam that I think challenges some of us is understanding this concept of Sharia law. Now, in some ways, that should not be so odd for Catholics because we have canon law, and that governs my life as a religious woman. We live in a diocese, so canon law applies to property. Like Notre Dame College is a Catholic institution, and so the property comes under canon law. The Orthodox Jewish tradition keeps kosher and honors halakha. So could you talk a little bit about Sharia law and what that really means to a 21st century Muslim in Ohio or Bloomington, Indiana?
Well, first of all, I have to question the use of the term Sharia law itself. It's used a lot in the media. You hear it all the time, right? And so I am not surprised that many people will pick up that term and use it that way. But Sharia is not law. It's just not law. So Sharia literally means in Arabic, the way, and it's the way to the water. Now, water, of course, to us is the source of life, right, on earth. And that's what the Sharia actually implies. So it is the way to the truth, way to goodness, way to fulfillment in one's life. So the Sharia, which is drawn from the Quran and the Sunnah refers to the practices of the Prophet Muhammad and also his sayings, which are known as the Hadith. I think, Ronil, you actually referred to that. The Sharia contains broad principles, ethical, moral, and legal principles that need to be interpreted by human beings in order to derive specific rules and regulations. So the actual interpretation of the Sharia is of human origin. The interpreted rules that we get are human-made, right? So they are ultimately fallible, they can be changed, but they're also dynamic. As circumstances change, Muslims can always go back to the Sharia, reinterpret certain critical and foundational principles in order to come up with rules that are appropriate and relevant in a changed context. For example, the Sharia tells Muslims to be always just. Now, our notions of justice have changed a lot over the centuries. Think about it. There are certain things we used to consider to be just when applied to women in the pre-modern world. We tried to protect women. We didn't think it was right for them to go out and get a job. Now, if we were to restrict women's ability to, get a higher education and then seek employment just as much as any male would, we would consider that unjust, right? So our notions of justice have changed. Think about issues of slavery. Perfectly moral people in the pre-modern past thought, as long as you were nice to your enslaved people in your household, that was just enough. Nowadays, no one, at least I hope, absolutely no one would accept that as approximating justice in any way, right? So our notions of justice have changed considerably, dramatically. So these principles can be revisited in every century, in every context, and reinterpreted to accord with what we understand to be just in any given time. So Sharia, again, to repeat myself, is not law. It is the source of legislation. It contains the foundational principles that have to be interpreted by human beings using their faculty of reasoning, their intellect, in order to derive these rules. And these rules are then fundamentally changeable. So it's a very dynamic process. The resulting, if I can give you a scary Arabic word, when we talk about Islamic law, we're actually talking about fiqh, F-I-Q-H, which is sometimes translated into English as jurisprudence. It means the study of the law, the study of Sharia. So when we talk about Islamic law, we're really talking about fiqh and not Sharia. And if I can impress this upon your students so that they learn to make these distinctions, I think I will have accomplished my purpose here today. And the Sharia, of course, because it is also supremely concerned with ethics, we often don't think about, at least, in modern popular discourses in the West, we often don't think about Sharia when we talk about Muslims who are being commanded, again, to give charity, to be kind to their neighbors, to be just in their interactions with everybody, to deal with people kindly, to be kind. That's part of the Sharia too, right? So yeah, it's a much broader concept than law, and I think we do a great disservice to that notion when we reduce it to law. It is a much broader, much more holistic code of conduct, if you like, that guides many aspects of a Muslim's life.
Thank you. Ronil, didn't that broaden your understanding of the concept?
It did, actually. So just to touch on that with your Sharia law question, I actually would like you to expound a little bit. You said a little part of the role with the women in Islam. My question would be, can you talk about women's place in Islam as like throughout the tradition? Has it like evolved over time? Is the women's role changing? Can you just like expound on that for me?
Sure. Yeah. The Quran actually gives women a lot of rights, rights that maybe even some Muslims may not be aware of, because I think many Muslims will listen to the interpretations of certain people rather than go back to the Quran itself and read the Quran for oneself and find out, what's actually said there. Of course, as we know, the law is always articulated in a specific cultural context. So the way some of these verses were interpreted over time reflect the cultural influence of the milieu in which these jurists were interpreting some of these critical verses and then formulating laws. One of the most dramatic rights, if you like, or even revolutionary rights that were granted to women within Islam is the right to hold property in their own name. Now, remember, in the 7th century, I can't think of any other society that had granted this right to women, the right to hold property in their own names. That right remained with them even if they got married. Typically, in most societies of the time, once a woman got married, her husband was the one who automatically became the owner of her wealth, the possessor of her wealth, and he alone could dispose of it as he wished. That was not true in Islam. And so because women had that financial independence, they could sometimes rise to great heights. A number of them became powerful benefactors of hospitals, educational institutions, of charitable endowments, and so forth. Which gave them a certain level of influence and clout within society. Another very important right granted to women in Islam is the right to acquire knowledge equally with men. If you pick up the Quran, it constantly exhorts its readers, male and female, to acquire knowledge. Now, as a result of this, girls and women had access to education, and some of them were able to become very well-known, prominent teachers of both male and female students. How do we know this? Because their grateful students recorded their names in their publications and named these professors by their names. So we know that they were women and that they were actively engaged in this process of disseminating knowledge and educating the subsequent generations of scholars and academics and so forth. But these interpretations were not happening in a vacuum. In certain cultures, there were deeply entrenched patriarchal norms. And ultimately, in a number of the societies, these patriarchal norms not completely erased the more egalitarian notions that we find in the Quran and in the early Islamic centuries, but certainly marginalized some of these egalitarian notions. And so, as you know, in patriarchal society, it's men who rule. Some of these ideas are actually coming in from the outside. As Islam expanded, and we know that Islam became a world civilization very soon after it came into being in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. It expanded to what we now call the Middle East, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Persia, and so forth. And Islamic notions of egalitarianism then came into contact with some of these more hierarchical notions that emphasized differences among human beings. And one of those differences were gender differences, right? So over time, Muslim women did suffer a reduction, a diminution in their rights. We find less and less women actually being engaged in the whole process of scholarship and education, and they don't completely disappear. We still find their names in the later sources, but they're not as active in society as they were, particularly in the first 3 centuries of Islam. So what has happened in the modern period, and this is a topic that I discuss with great relish in my book, The Contemporary Issues in Islam, is that because now more and more women are being educated in Muslim majority countries, they can read the sources for themselves. They are questioning a number of these patriarchal interpretations of specific Quranic verses that deal with women's rights. And they're revisiting a number of these interpretations that have taken deep hold within many Muslim majority societies. So you have such a variety in the conceptions of women's rights. If you compare Saudi Arabia, which until very recently didn't even allow women to drive, right? Now that you don't find anywhere else in the Muslim world. I'm not sure what, pun intended here, what drove them to that conclusion. But there really is no basis for it. The other verse that I cited earlier from Quran 971, men and women are the partners of one another. That basically sets up a complete equality in responsibility and their ability to effect reform in the larger societies. And there's one, if I may, one particular verse that drives home this message unambiguously, without ifs or buts. And I'll read that to you. It's kind of repetitive, but bear with me. It's from chapter 33, verse 35. And the verse states, "Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and patient women, the humble men and humble women, the charitable men and charitable women, the fasting men and fasting women, the men who guard their private parts and the women who do so, and the men who remember God often and the women who do so. For them, God has prepared forgiveness and a great reward." The verse emphasizes that men and women's actions of righteousness, of goodness, are valued equally, and they will reap their reward equally in the next world. When you read this passage for the first time, you're just completely blown away by the absolute equality that is stressed between men and women, and that there's absolutely no distinction in the worth of their actions, right? So the Quran doesn't recognize any gender difference when it comes to piety and righteousness. But over time, male interpreters of the Quran have imposed such gender differences. This is something that we see throughout history in other faith traditions, as women themselves now are claiming ownership of that tradition. We can see how those interpretations are being challenged, undermined, and replaced with much more egalitarian interpretations.
Well, I have to say, you're really very clear and logical in your explanation. It's really helpful to opening our hearts and our minds. This is just such a gift to the college community, and I think to our interfaith efforts at Dialogue. We don't have a lot of time here, and there's a couple of more topics that we'd like to consider. And one is community. So community means a lot. The Christian community comes together to celebrate Eucharist. So how do you see, how do you understand and celebrate community in your tradition?
Community is very, very important. So the global Muslim community is called the Ummah. I think you may have heard that word. And this is an important concept because it undermines the notion of national belonging or ethnic belonging or racial identities. The belief is that by virtue of being a Muslim, by virtue of being a righteous person, you automatically belong to this ummah. Doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, what your social status is. You have to realize this was an extremely revolutionary concept in the 7th century. And I would hazard to say it's still a revolutionary concept in our own time when we can transcend some of those constructed social differences, right? We tend to be more concerned about people's social status. How much do they earn? How do they look? What families they come from? These questions and what ethnic group they belong to. Do they belong to the dominant group within a given society, or do they belong to a less prestigious group, right? We're often concerned with that. And even in contemporary America, we are racked by differences based on ethnicity and race and so forth, and certainly socioeconomic status, right? That matters a lot. But the concept of the ummah is really powerful. And it was challenging 7th century Arabian society that valued a person based on their lineage and their membership within a tribe. If you belong to a powerful tribe, your status in society was much, much higher compared to a person who came from a less prestigious tribe or came from the margins of society. Those people were looked down on. Now, on a much more local level, community is extremely important. Whenever I move to any city, I try to find the local mosque. And that's how you find, members of your faith community. The sense of belonging, I think, for all of us, all in our different faith traditions, is very important. One of the ways that sense of community is driven home is when people come together for prayer. So communal prayer is extremely important within the Islamic tradition, as it is within the Christian and Jewish traditions. There is a special day set aside, Friday, for the Friday congregational prayer. If you walk into any mosque in any city, anywhere in the world, you will find Muslims gathered to carry out the noon prayers on Friday, which is then also accompanied by a sermon given by the leader, the imam of the congregation. There are hadiths that say that, of course, it's always virtuous to pray to God, to worship him. But if you do it in congregation, the merit is higher, because you're also then cultivating a sense of fellowship and communal solidarity, which is, again, very important within Islam and in most world religions that I am aware of. So I would say community is certainly very important. It's played an important role in my own life, and I know it means a lot to other fellow Muslims. That sense of camaraderie, that sense of being united in a common purpose for a greater good, right? I think it can be very ennobling, very uplifting, and really valuable.
Thank you. I think that Dr. Asarudin sort of answered your next question. So why don't you jump to your final question, Ronil, and then I'll have one more as well. Thanks,
Okay.
Ronil.
Honestly, my final question is my favorite question. A lot of people don't know. Actually, Sister Carol doesn't even know this about me. So no one watching this will ever know this about me. My middle name is Jihad. Yes. I promise you it is. Sister Carol just learned something new about me. So did you, Doctor. So my question to end this off would be, can you just, in your own words, can you convey what jihad means? Take as much time as you want. I have emotional connection to this one, obviously, because it is my middle name, but it's so different. Everyone has different ideas. People see it, like you said, there's a media takeover of a lot of Muslim works. So people see it, especially after 9/11, how things reflect on that. They see it as like something controversial. So if you can touch base on that and just share it with me, please.
Sure. I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of my new book.
Thank you.
So jihad is an Arabic word, actually means effort, struggle, striving, right? So anything, any effort that we make towards a good and noble purpose counts as jihad. The fact that I struggled to get out of bed this morning when my alarm went off at an unconscionably early hour, that counts as jihad. The fact that I'm struggling now to find the correct words to convey my ideas, that's also part of jihad. So jihad at a very kind of basic and a quotidian meaning, you know, like a daily, ordinary meaning, is anything that we do that contributes to our well-being and the well-being of others, that contributes to the common good. All that is part of jihad. Now, there are many ways to carry out jihad. So there's at the personal level. The most important aspect of jihad for a human being, for an individual, is the spiritual one. We all fall prey to bad thoughts, right? To bad impulses. Our effort to fight those bad impulses, our lower self, so to speak, right? That tries to prod us into doing something wrong and that we know is wrong, but it's sometimes hard to fight against those impulses. That very effort is called jihad and is known as spiritual struggle. On a broader communal level, there's a fundamental moral commandment within Islam that exhorts Muslims to always promote what is good and to prevent what is wrong. Anything that is noble and just, a Muslim is supposed to promote. Anything that is degrading and unjust and contributes to the loss of dignity for our fellow human beings, that should be prevented and fought against. So at a communal level, a word of advice to someone who may be thinking of embarking on something bad and dissuading that person from carrying out that bad deed, that's part of jihad. That's part of our social and communal jihad. At the state level, what if we have an outside aggressor attacking us, encroaching on our territory, and threatening us with danger? Then the state has to fight back and has to fight back through armed combat. That is the military jihad. Now, that is the aspect of jihad I think we tend to hear the most in news coverage, right, in the media. And oftentimes they're, of course, covering these militant groups in parts of the Muslim majority world that are causing havoc in those areas. And they're the ones who have helped to make this militant aspect of jihad the predominant one in the modern West. These militants, however, are not carrying out a jihad. For a military jihad to be considered a legitimate jihad, it has to be declared by a legitimate head of state. You have to observe scrupulously the rules of conduct, of humane conduct. You can never target civilians. Civilians include women, children, the elderly, anyone who doesn't bear a weapon in their hands are to be protected. You're supposed to protect the environment. You cannot cause wanton destruction of property. All non-combatants must be protected against harm. The militants, of course, have violated each and every single rule pertaining to the proper conduct of a military jihad. So jihad in its military aspects, very similar to the Christian concept of just war, where again, it's the legitimate ruler who can declare a just war, and the cause has to be a just one as well. So the just cause that is recognized within military jihad within Islam is that of self-defense. So if someone does attack you, then you are of course permitted to fight back in self-defense and for no other reason. So this is an important point to keep in mind. This message is very strong in the Quran. It's something I try to emphasize in my book. So Ronil, I want to say you should be very proud of having jihad as your middle name. Because
Thank you, I am. Thank you.
What you're doing is signaling to people that you're struggling, that you're striving to live up to your name by trying to struggle and make the extra effort to promote what is good and try to prevent what is wrong, and therefore living up to, I would say, your highest calling as a human being. So thank you, Ronil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roniel, for sharing that with us.
Okay.
My last question is about pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is so important in the Christian tradition. People make a pilgrimage to Rome or to Jerusalem, or there's the Camino Santiago, the pilgrimage across northern Spain to the Church of St. James. So maybe you can just end up by telling us a little bit about pilgrimage and if you've made one or if you're hoping to make the pilgrimage to Mecca.
Yes. So pilgrimage, known by its Arabic name Hajj, is one of the pillars of Islam. There are 5 pillars. I think many of you know that. Faith, which is obviously the first one. Second is offering prayers, the 5 daily prayers. Third is charity, the obligatory alms that are given to the poor, the needy, the destitute, widows, orphans, and so forth. Then you have the fast during the month of Ramadan. That's the 9th month of the Islamic year when the Quran began to be revealed. And Muslims fast from dawn to dusk, fasting meaning refraining completely from eating and drinking. And it's for about 29 to 30 days during the month of Ramadan. And then finally, Hajj. The Hajj is actually a conditional pillar, a conditional requirement. It's obligatory only for those who have the financial means to undertake the journey. It can be costly after all, and are physically able to carry it out. So if you're infirm, if you're not in good health, and you also don't have the financial means to undertake the pilgrimage, then you're absolved from that requirement. I myself have not done the full pilgrimage to Mecca. I hope so. I hope to do so, God willing. It's something I very much look forward to. The Hajj has to do actually with the central figure of Abraham. Since I'm giving the Abrahamic lecture for the Abrahamic Center, I think that's very important for us to realize. According to Islamic tradition, it's Abraham and his son Ishmael who laid the foundations of the Kaaba, the cubic building that we see in Mecca, and in the direction of which all Muslims face when they pray during the day. And so, yes, it is exhorted, Muslims are exhorted to carry out this pilgrimage to Mecca if they can. Not everyone is able to. There's also a shorter form of the pilgrimage that you can do at any time of the year. The Hajj, the official pilgrimage, is actually carried out only during the month of Hajj, which comes at a certain time. And because it's a lunar calendar, it actually moves through the year. And so right now it's during the summer, but in another 6 years or so, it will move into the colder months. There was one other point that I wanted to make. One of the principles that's very, very important in Islam and in the other Abrahamic religions as well is the preservation of life, right? Not only your own life, but the lives of others. Now, what do you do in circumstances where your life is so threatened by either an external danger or, and I think you know where I'm going with this, by a plague, as happened during the recent pandemic? So last summer, the pandemic was still raging, and Muslims wanted to go on the Hajj. It's a very difficult decision for the relevant authorities to make. But the question became, are we going to permit Muslims to carry out this requirement? Or should we not prioritize the preservation of life, human lives everywhere, and suspend the Hajj for that year? And that's exactly what happened. There were a number of Muslims who had saved, their life savings and were planning to go on this extremely important trip of their lives, and were very disappointed. But of course, the decision makes sense from a moral viewpoint, from the viewpoint of saving human lives, right? Which is a basic consideration. So there's a certain religious ethics that we can see emerging. Certain principles, ideals must always take precedence. Even when a religious observance may be, maybe in the mix, the question always has to be, does God want us to prioritize the saving of life and to protect the integrity of every human being? The answer has to be yes. So I wanted to end on that note, because I think sometimes Islam might be presented as more of a legalistic religion compared to Christianity. But if you don't have the law animated by a sense of compassion and a sense of mercy and concern for a fellow human being, then I think that law or that particular ruling will have missed the mark, right? Laws are here to glorify God, to enhance our worship of God, but ultimately also to be a source of mercy and justice. And this is what is really emphasized in the Sharia. And I think it's emphasized in the common moral landscape or environment that we all inhabit as part of the Abrahamic family.
Oh my God, what a fabulous way to end. Really, this has been so enlightening, so valuable. I think shared with us some of the important conversations that we need to have going forward. We're sorry that we could not meet with you personally or have you be involved in a book signing for us here at Notre Dame College. But I think we're going to pretend, Ronil, we're going to be the whole community here as we give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Can I just say that I am truly sorry too that I cannot be there in person. I would have loved to have engaged more of your students as well and have had the chance to converse with them. But God willing, there might be another opportunity, another chance. But I'm grateful that we were able to communicate at least in this way.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate that.
I appreciate it too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.